Welcome back to How to Fix Democracy, the show about contemporary democracy. In our fourth series, we've been focusing on the health of American democracy. We're trying to be doctors, if you like. American democracy has come in and we're evaluating its general health. We're giving it a physical. And today, my guest, Cynthia Miller-Idriss, very distinguished academic and expert on the far right, and her latest book, Hate in the Homeland, is a book, I think, in many ways about that very health of American democracy. Cynthia, welcome to How to Fix Democracy.
Thanks for having me.
So let's extend the medical metaphor, Cynthia. American democracy wanders into your university office for a checkup. How healthy is it?
I'd say it's definitely not terribly healthy. I mean, we as a country were added to a global list of backsliding democracies at the end of 2021. And, I will say, like any good academic, the first question I asked is, well, what does that data say about what happens when countries get added to that list? So I looked into the data from that organization, which is based in Sweden. And it turns out that you have about 9 years on average before a country moves off of that list in one direction or the other. So either they collapse or they are restored. And so, we're a sick democracy in the sense of being ill or flailing a little bit right now, which is not just my assessment, but the assessment of this international group that put us on the list of backsliding democracies based on election interference and lack of trust in government and rising political violence and all kinds of things. But, it's not an immediate, it's not typically an immediate kind of malignancy, right? It's a slow burning kind of a thing that you have time to treat and that there are remedies for it, I guess, if you want to extend that metaphor a little better.
As I said, your new book, Hate in the Homeland, the new global far right, focuses on the danger to democracy of the far right. Do you believe that the dangers from the far right exceed those from the left? We did a show recently with Peter Wehner, a prominent American conservative, who does indeed believe that the real threat to American democracy comes from the right, even though there are some threats from the left.
Yeah, I think the data, and this is very clear that there is, if you're talking about violence, there's definitely rising political violence from the left as well as on the right, but the violent acts are much higher. The conspiracy charges that have been levied are on the right, that none of the cases have been made despite multiple attempts on the federal side to make cases against, Antifa or against the left, let's say. So, there are problems on the left, and certainly there's no excuse for violence. And I am continuing to be concerned about violence across the political spectrum, but all of the data point, including from the FBI, the DHS threat assessments, that are continually released. There was one released in June 2022. All of those threat assessments still point to white supremacist extremism and anti-government extremism, or specifically violent militia extremism, as the primary threats on the domestic spectrum. So again, doesn't mean those are the only threats or the only ones that we will see, but they are the ones that are posing the biggest threat at this time.
Where do you draw the line between what you call the far right and a mainstream right, particularly in the Republican Party, where a significant proportion, for example, of voters, of members of the party, believe in what Donald Trump called the big lie? Most of us, I don't think, would agree with him. But to what extent has the far right, and I use this word carefully, infected the entire party?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I use the term far right, and I often say it's the best bad term we have available. All of these terms are flawed, but the far right I use as a term to capture both supremacist forms of thinking, which are dehumanizing and which set up hierarchies of superiority and inferiority. And that is most typically white supremacist extremism, but also male supremacism, Christian supremacism, Western supremacism. So you have groups like the Proud Boys who call themselves Western chauvinists, right? So there are lots of different forms of that kind of supremacist thinking that can dehumanize, that can create a sense of existential threat through these conspiracies like the Great Replacement, that motivated the Buffalo terrorist attacker, and in Pittsburgh and El Paso and elsewhere, these ideas that immigrants or Jews or Muslims or people of color are a threat to white civilization. That's the idea of the Great Replacement, this racist conspiracy theory. So that's that supremacist side. The other side of it is the anti-government and anti-democratic side that promotes authoritarianism, that rejects the rule of law, that refuses to protect minority rights, things that are core tenets of a liberal democracy, as defined, in our Constitution. And we are definitely seeing mainstreaming of both of those sets of categories into, not from the fringe, but in the regular mainstream political parties, including, support for conspiracy theories like QAnon, but also, support for the Great Replacement idea and conspiracy theory as well. So, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's infected the entire Republican Party, but you can no longer use a definition of extremism the way some folks have used it, as something that means it's outside of the mainstream. It is a way of thinking that has also become normalized in parts of the mainstream in ways that we have to challenge from within as well.
It's interesting you use the term, Cynthia, normalization. Is extremism an aberration in the human condition? Is it something that, extending the medical metaphor, reflects a kind of sickness that needs to be fixed?
Well, there's always a spectrum, right? So you've got radical, how we define radical and what we define as extreme will shift over time. A lot of folks who were defined as radical in their time are later recognized as great civil rights leaders, right? For example, or as helping to overturn the South African apartheid system, let's say, even though they spent decades in jail, right? So they were arrested as radicals or as even considered to be kind of extremists against the government. So these things are relative, and all of that has to be considered. So is it a part of the human condition? Yes, I think you always have a spectrum, and I think there are always beliefs that exist on the fringes of that spectrum. Part of the problem is when those belief systems begin to be echoed within the mainstream, either by elected officials or on, cable news networks, or, when people start to hear some of those things reflected, two things happen. One is the normalization that I talked about, and the other is a perceived legitimation. And I say perceived because we don't always know the intent, right? So when, for example, Trump in one of the debates told the Proud Boys, said, stand back, stand by, nobody will ever know. I don't think you could ever know what he actually meant by that, but we do know how it was received by the Proud Boys immediately as a mark of a boost of energy, as a legitimation of their views. They had t-shirts made up within 12 hours or something, selling that slogan on it, saw it as a kind of call to arms. And so that when people hear, and we know that about the Great Replacement, we know that about conspiracy theories about migrant caravans, right? That all of those kinds of things reinforce and give oxygen to fringe and violent sometimes beliefs and behaviors, because they see an echo in the mainstream as a mark of legitimacy or of support, even if that wasn't the intent. And again, I think proving intent is really difficult. It's hard to know.
But Cynthia, what happens when the fringe and the mainstream become the same? Yeah. Let's take the War Room podcast of Steve Bannon, certainly somebody who is a very articulate mouthpiece and thinker on the new global far right, perhaps its most, I use this word carefully, distinguished figure, certainly more distinguished than Donald Trump. He's incredibly popular. That podcast is perhaps the most popular podcast on the internet. Many hundreds of thousands, millions of followers. He makes movies, he has a television network. The mainstream and the fringe have met. They're the same, aren't they?
Yeah, no, I just saw some data, this summer that indicated that, that we continue to have millions and millions of Americans who believe that our current president Biden is illegitimate, who continue to believe even that violence would be justified if Trump were to come reassert somehow and become president again. So we have, it's one of the reasons why I often argue for an approach that is drawn on the German post-Holocaust approach called defensive democracy. The idea is that you can never meaningfully confront the fringe by only keeping your eyes on the fringe, by only looking at the fringes, which is essentially what we in the States have tried to do with domestic violent extremism, is barricade the doors against them, train people in crisis mitigation, and try to arrest and ban and use intelligence to infiltrate plots and get ourselves out of this mess that way. But but when you don't have the democratic resilience in the mainstream to reject propaganda and disinformation, you start to have a whole different problem. I used to use this metaphor before COVID, but we've been treating it as if it's a tumor that can be isolated, and kept away from everything else, instead of seeing it as a virus that actually can spread within the mainstream. And so part of what we need is a different approach, which isn't just security focused, but is education and public health type focus of equipping the mainstream with tools to be more resilient.
You talk about what we need, but Cynthia, the we here, maybe the minority. This idea that we, the academic community, the media community, people like you and I, we should be, quote unquote, re-educating people who believe in these theories might sound quite chilling. Certainly to them, of course, but maybe even to other liberals.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel like I would say to that, what is a democracy? And, it isn't educating people about the basic tenets of democracy, including even just things like source integrity or how propaganda works, part of the task of democratic life and of a liberal democracy. So, I don't believe that we can have a democracy that just, obviously it's not working for, we're on a list of backsliding democracies. If we want to have a democracy, then I think we have to continue to foster that. And one of the things we've seen is that it needs care and feeding. It doesn't just thrive on its own, particularly in a media ecosystem with vast amounts of disinformation coming at people across social media and even in their mainstream news channels that they are obviously very persuaded by, and that is antithetical to the basic tenets of democracy. So, I agree with you from a sort of civil rights perspective, from an ACLU perspective, from a privacy perspective. I don't want anyone policing my thoughts. At the same time, I think that we have, to go back to the medical metaphor, we invested decades ago in a new approach to treating medical diseases like cardiac disease or diabetes that didn't just wait for symptoms to appear and then try to fix things, but rather decided to educate communities about the behavioral and attitudinal choices they could make that might reduce the incidence of disease for them personally and for their communities and their families. So about healthy food and about exercise, et cetera, and also worked to reduce the structural problems that led to higher incidences of those diseases, like food deserts or a lack of healthy food options in supermarkets in poorer or urban communities. So that's a public health approach when I talk about that. Nobody's telling people you have to eat this way or this must be. We're not trying to indoctrinate you into eating it or behaving or exercising a certain way, but you're equipping people with the tools to make their own choices with a full spectrum of information. That's the argument that I would make on the public health side of it, is that people don't automatically have that knowledge about how the digital ecosystem works or how propaganda works or why it's persuasive, and they deserve it.
It's an interesting comparison, and let's think it through. Someone's unhealthy, overweight, unfit, they come into your office as a doctor and you say, well, look, if you eat better, if you exercise, you're going to live longer, you're going to be happier, you're going to sleep better. it's not a hard argument to make, and it's very hard to argue against. I guess there'll be some people who simply say, oh, I love fast food, I love alcohol, and I'm happy to die at 40 because that's just the nature of things. But most people wouldn't say that. Extending that to democracy, what happens if you get a kid who comes into your office and says, look, I believe in all this stuff. I'm online all the time. I go into these groups. I believe that whites or Christians or Americans are superior to everyone else. Men are superior to women. I believe in this. Why should I change my mind? What's the value of democracy to me? I understand the value of someone's life, but what's the best argument you would make in favor of democracy when speaking to the new global right? Not the Steve Bannons who you're never going to convince, but some kid who happened to go into a chat room and is still possibly able to be, and I use this word carefully, re-educated.
Yeah, I should say, I'm not a fan of or a proponent. I mean, I don't work in the re-education sphere or in the disengagement or what we sometimes call de-radicalization sphere. Not that I don't think that's important, and there are organizations that do that. I work on what's called primary prevention, which is the idea that you're trying to reduce the fertile ground in which any of this stuff can thrive in the first place. So trying to change people's minds is a different story than trying to prevent them from being persuaded by propaganda or disinformation in the first place. Not only do I think it's trickier empirically, there's very little evidence that it can be done. In fact, I've never seen evidence that it can be done at scale. It's also very difficult. I've only heard anecdotally of cases where people have successfully initiated it. What usually happens is that people want to change their minds and then need support to do so. So when we see people exit, extremist scenes or movements or groups, for example, or give up on conspiracy theories like QAnon, they sometimes need support because they've gone down a rabbit hole and they've lost touch with they've lost their jobs. Sometimes they've lost their family members, right? They may need therapeutic support or engagement, or sometimes almost rehabilitative support, right? To get a job again, et cetera. And there are groups that actually work on those things, like Exit Germany, Exit Sweden, Life After Hate here in the US. Those are groups that actually work to, and sometimes they have, there are some cases where they say they have, people have been referred to them, they've been able to disengage, but is very much a one-on-one process. That is a skill set that would be more on the psychology side, certainly not in my skill set, and not what we do in my research lab. We work on the much broader, earlier community-based prevention side, trying to teach community members about red flags and warning signs. How would you know as a parent or a teacher or a coach, if somebody was, things like, some of it seems so basic, but we see it again and again that terrorist actors previously showed signs of things like self-harm or animal cruelty or, not just ideological expressions, but things that just show that there's something deeply wrong and that they need some help, and often are not getting it or not being referred or reported. So it's a fair question and a good question, but also one that I think is for a different type of expertise, and one that it's not that I don't believe in it. I do think that it's important and it can be done, but it is not scalable in the way that I think we need intervention and prevention resources to be directed right now.
What about the generational elements, Cynthia? Much has been said, and we've talked about it in some detail on the show, on the anxiety of the younger generation, particularly in times of COVID. How does this play into hate, extremism? Is there a connection between the rise of anxiety amongst young people? And much of it is, of course, bound up in the internet, isolation, loneliness, self-hate, harm. You talked about that. Do we need to confront the epidemic of anxiety if we're to confront the epidemic of right-wing extremism?
I think that, so there's two different issues happening, and one is really hard to disentangle at the moment about what's specific to COVID and whether we're in a new trend or not. So I will say that on the political violence side, we're seeing much older actors engaged than we typically see. So that's unusual. The average age of folks arrested for criminal offenses on January 6th, for example, I think is in the 40s, right? So this is unusual. We don't know, and we had people there in their 60s and 70s. You don't normally see that. On the white supremacist side in particular, recent attacks, those typically do tend to be much younger individuals, 18, 19, 20. And I would say it's a combination of factors. There are certain vulnerabilities that make young people, they're more prone to violence to begin with, but also maybe more easily persuaded by propaganda when they're looking for identity or sense of meaning or belonging, way to be a part of something. But they also just tend to spend a ton of time online. So American teenagers spend more than half their waking hours online, about 9 hours a day on average. And that is, and there's a lot of harmful content circulating in spaces where young people spend time on the chans and on these fora, online gaming fora, servers, places where things very quickly can turn toxic and where hateful and harassing content kind of is ubiquitous even, and can open up gateways. It doesn't mean that it does, but where you get a link to something else and it takes you to someplace else, get invited to an encrypted chat room or to a server where there's darker things going on. And so it becomes a kind of a gateway into something else. So it's a combination of things. It's not just like there's these isolated, folks wandering around who become vulnerable, but when they are, because they're often quite well networked online and they do have their communities of people online, but they're communities that are quite toxic. And where they kind of are rewarded in a way for toxic behavior, where they get a sense of power from trolling or harassing others. And of course, we also have to point out the fact that these are almost always men. And so there's a lot of issues of, we see a lot of misogyny and male supremacy kind of coming out, a lot of rape threats, kidnap threats, threats against women expressed in these spaces. The memes are often terribly misogynistic, and a lot of meme-based hate is communicated, Holocaust denial through jokes and memes and irony and satire, all of which makes it kind of gamifies the hate in these youth online spaces in a way that can make it fun, and where they get desensitized to the hate and all while under the guise of kind of plausible deniability, because it's just a joke that triggered snowflake adults don't get, right? And so that kind of stuff we see all the time. And I think we see a lot of times this dehumanizing content, for example, Holocaust denial memes. That's a perfect example, just horrific jokes about the Holocaust that kids are sharing in text chains, for example, but not even really understanding or recognizing the origins or the content itself. It's just a joke that everybody shares, is the way they explain it. They're so far removed from the original understanding, and they're not really getting it. And so that's what I mean by some of that basic reduce the fertile ground, a little bit more understanding about some of the dehumanizing content itself, to understand what it is that they're sharing could go a long way.
The show is called How to Fix Democracy. So how do we fix what you're studying, Cynthia? Does it simply require more internet regulation, more transparency, more accountability of the platforms?
Yeah.
The Reddits of the world, do they need to be accountable for the evil that's peddled on them?
Yeah. So I'm going to say something a little bit pessimistic, which is that I don't know how we can repair the damage that's already been done at this point. There are strategies to rebuild trust that, organizations that have worked in conflict zones, right, have proven work in places like, Rwanda, Congo, right? There's really good work that's been done. And I think that kind of work has to come here. That's a remedial type of thing when you're talking about repair and fixing and restoring trust and reducing people's willingness to see political violence as a solution, for example, or violence in general. What I do think, the more optimistic side of it for me is, how do you prevent things from getting worse? And there, I think, where we're really lacking, I think, is investment in any kind of preventative work that is focused on equipping the mainstream, focused on reducing that fertile ground. These are things that our allies overseas do quite a lot of, that we really don't. We see this problem through a law enforcement lens, and we see it as something that we can arrest or ban our way out of. And I don't think that's the case. So we do need regulation. We do need moderation. The social media companies can remove a lot of the bad content, but they will never get it all. And you know, even these live stream videos, I mean, they just circulate. They circulate, and then sometimes they run on social media platforms with advertisements next to them because of the way they out of guns, as we just saw in a New York Times article about the Buffalo shooting. And so there are you know, plenty of problems of just relying on the banning and the arrest and the surveillance and the intelligence model of this, whether that's through social media or whether it's through a securitized view of preventing terrorism. Not to say that we shouldn't do any of those things, but it will never be enough if we're not also investing in ways to reduce the fertile ground in which this stuff thrives.
Let me take an unpopular position. You won't agree, and many of our audience won't. I'm not sure I would agree either, but let's just say we lose democracy. I mean, life goes on very well in Hungary, in China, these prosperous countries. People seem reasonably happy, much less threat of violence. What will we lose if we lose
I mean, I think
democracy in America? You'll still have a job at your university. You'll still do your research.
Maybe. I think that's a really privileged way to look at it that is risky, right? I mean, I think
Why is it privileged?
Because I think that I'm not sure that Muslim Americans or Latino Americans or people without papers who are citizens who are not yet, don't have a green card. I mean, people who are not yet citizens, but let's say have a green card, or women facing reproductive losses of rights, like feel that they want to live in in anything less democratic than we have right now. So you know, I think there are people here across the political spectrum who say democracy has failed and try something else. But I haven't seen a model anywhere else that that is a system I want to live in. And, you know, I spent a lot of time working in Eastern Europe and in East Germany, and just after the wall came down, and know a lot of folks who just wanted to get out of those systems, right? Who felt freedom to make choices was better than the systems they were living with and the kinds of corruption that ensued. So, you know, it's a fair question, but the answer I have is that I don't see an alternative that allows for the freedom for people who are more vulnerable to feel protected, for people to feel like their rights are protected. I'm not convinced there's any other model out there that would allow for a life to continue on for people who are vulnerable or have any other kinds of needs other than security that we already have right now. I mean, those of us who have the security, I guess that's a privileged thing that I'm trying to say.
I'm not sure I necessarily agree. I mean, if you look at the history of American democracy, say this century, certainly over the last 10 years, what it seems to have created is more and more inequality, and more tiny privileged class of incredibly wealthy people. So it's not clear to me that American democracy has benefited the people. It's benefited a tiny class, and they're the ones with the money. They're the ones with the power. So,
I mean, what's your alternative?
What the alternative might be, say, more of a technocratic system in Singapore, perhaps even in China. I don't know. I mean, I'm not, as you know, I mean, I'm in your camp, but what worries me is that it's increasingly clear that that argument has now a degree of credibility that it certainly didn't have 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, well, I will say that I think that moderates and even liberals have not told a very compelling story of why democracy is. I mean, I'm not even really telling it very clearly myself here, right? Because it's just such an assumption, such a knee-jerk assumption that it is the better case. And so that may be part of the problem as well, is that we're losing people from even within the moderate camp who just don't care that much anymore because they can't see why things would be worse for them, even though I do think they would be. or personally, I just don't see systems where, especially at this scale of a country, where it would pan out very well.
So perhaps it's more about telling stories than prevention.
Yeah, could be. I mean, I'm not a storyteller myself, so I think there are folks out there. I think there are a lot of good documentary producers. I think there are a lot of good media folks and narrators who are trying to tell those stories. And that may be back to the question of restoring, that maybe that's the answer on the restoring side of things. But I would say part of that fits into the civic education side too. I think, I do think that over the last 20, 30 years in American public education, we have fixated so much on kind of basic basic literacy and math scores and kind of this whole teacher incentives to that are based on test scores for students, and which leads to a lot of teaching to the test. We have certainly not focused very much on a kind of shared story or shared narrative about what democracy is. We can't even agree on it right now, right? Without it getting labeled something like CRT or that the attacks on education and curriculum itself show that we have very different stories about what kids should be taught in any given community or state. So I think that's part of the problem too, that the story is not just a story for the basic public, but also whatever story we're telling in schools and in curriculum as well.
Cynthia, the subtitle of your new book, Hating the Homeland, is The New Global Far Right. America shares the crisis of democracy in America. Is like the crisis of democracy in some ways around the world. Trump and Putin and Orban and Duterte and Bolsonaro, they have quite a lot in common. The same is true of this populist authoritarianism. But the one thing that distinguishes America from much of the rest of the world is the prevalence of firearms, of guns. How does that change hate in the homeland for you and the threat to democracy? What is it about this proliferation of guns, this epidemic of guns in America and gun crime that makes the far right in America an even bigger threat?
Well, there's a couple of things. It certainly makes it more lethal here, right? So I think the last data I saw globally is the US is responsible for about half the far right terror incidents and about half the deaths. So that's disproportionately on us. And that is almost certainly because we tend to have a lot more shootings. There's a lot more guns here, it's much easier to pick up those guns and enact a lot more harm. But it creates an opportunity for a narrative. The Second Amendment narrative is, a lot of the propaganda that comes from the far right is about something being stolen or taken away from you, whether that is a white majority country or your Second Amendment rights or a stolen election, right? There's this constant narrative that you're going to lose something and it's being taken away from you. And often there's a conspiracy to do it, right? So somebody, whether it's the Democrats or Jews or Muslims or elites or coastal elites or whatever, these people are orchestrating something to take it away from you and and you're going to be worse off, and it's an existential threat, right? All of those things are part of this story, and Second Amendment rights play a role in that, that narrative around Second Amendment rights, because it gets manipulated often with disinformation and propaganda, as we saw in 2020 when there were these 22,000 armed individuals showed up in Richmond to protest perceived threats to Second Amendment rights. That was partly driven by disinformation about things like the governor was going to send the National Guard door to door to seize your guns, and Obama's coming for your guns, and Democrats are coming for your guns, right? So there's all kinds of fake accusations of things that play on that set of narratives. So some of it is the actual guns, and some of it is the propaganda about the guns, and some of it is the propaganda about the loss of guns. So it's used a lot of propaganda around family protection, protect your family, and this idea of being a protector that comes in a lot as well in the advertisements about guns and then the language. but also in the propaganda around, it's going to be taken away from you. So I think there are lots of ways in which that plays a role in the states in particular here in the US. But it's hard. You need a cultural kind of analysis of other countries to see how that propaganda plays out there. And maybe there are ways it shows up. It's just not about guns.
There are some people, Cynthia, Canadian journalist Stephen Marsh comes to mind, for example, who believe that America is already in a state of civil war. Do you think there's some truth to that?
I think we are at a really risky moment. I don't know that I would say already in a state of civil war, but
low level anyway.
Yeah, I think we are in a really difficult situation that when there's this much concern on so many different levels, both from traditional kind of terrorist threats and violence and mass violence and harm, but also the political violence. I mean, everybody gets worried, and we should be worried about the midterm elections, about the 2024 elections, political violence around the elections. How do you prevent it? But also even, worried about what happens when the Supreme Court, issues its ruling, what kind of violence is coming out, new security for the justices, what threats do reproductive medical providers face? I mean, there are all kinds of new levels of threats that just wouldn't have been really conceivable or even on our radar a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, right? And these are really, it's a rapidly evolving situation. And so that kind of volatility, it's not civil war yet, but it certainly feels like the precursors to a period of real instability.
Well, Cynthia, to end, cheer me up. This has been a rather depressing conversation.
Yeah.
It reflects reality. I mean, I think we have to have these conversations, but let's focus on one or two fixes that we can actually do. You mentioned education. I sometimes think that when people talk about education as a fix, it's because they can't really think of anything concrete. So they throw everything into the school and with teachers already overworked and underpaid. Where would you begin?
Yeah, I run a research
focus on real concrete fixes, which are doable in 2 or 3 years.
Right. So I run a research lab, we test interventions. And so the positive news is that we've tested about a dozen different things, and they've all worked in various ways to reduce the persuasiveness of propaganda for the population that we studied, to make them less likely to feel gratified by, let's say, white supremacist propaganda in one study, or by anti-vax propaganda. That we have evidence that you can equip communities. So we did a parents and caregivers toolkit that statistically showed significant improvements in parents' ability to both recognize red flags and warning signs and feel more empowered to intervene. We're now doing a longitudinal study to see over the course of a year, at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, do parents actually change their behavior and intervene when they do see a red flag or a warning sign. So, there are ways. I think part of what you have to do is, for example, like, spending the summer in a project thinking about social cohesion. So it turns out that social cohesion has lots of different components, right? How do you improve social cohesion if that's a desirable thing? That reduces polarization. Well, you need more trust in institutions. You need people to have a sense of belonging, and you need people to feel committed to something bigger than themselves. Well, each one of those things can be broken down into interventions that you can measure and see, did you actually improve people's trust in local institutions or in local government? How do you measure trust? So you have to break things down. You can't just say, we want to reduce extremism, or we want to reduce polarization, right? These things are too big and it feels too overwhelming. You can make small changes. And once you have evidence, this is where we are now, you have to figure out how to scale it up. That's a whole other question, but I don't think you can even begin to start talking about scaling it up without knowing what works. And we haven't really been there until right now. So this is a new moment, I think, to start thinking about how do you broaden this out beyond our 2,000 people in one study, right?
You've got your own lab, Cynthia, and that's certainly commendable. There'll be people watching this and think to themselves, how can I help, Cynthia? How can I get involved? Any suggestions?
I mean, I would say, there are lots of ways to get involved. You can send us an email at PERIL, PERIL @american.edu. We have all kinds of community-based resources in partnership with the Southern Poverty Law Center. We have videos that are animated videos to teach with educational guides. We do videos that are called inoculation, they're preventative videos. So we have a lot of different tools and resources. They're all free, available to the public. And you can get them through our website at american.edu/PERIL, PERIL. But mostly I would say, I don't think we're going to solve this set of problems at the national level. I think this has to happen within individual communities. And there are ways, we hear all the time from local communities who are doing all kinds of innovative things, creating websites, creating trainings, forming partnerships. There's interfaith work happening to connect people across borders, right? So there's lots of ways you can get involved in your local community to do things like improve trust, improve a sense of belonging, and improve a sense of commitment to a cause among everybody in that community in ways that we know will improve social cohesion and reduce polarization. So that's what I would say is like change has to be on the local level in order for it to happen on the national level.